On the morning of Sunday the 21st of November, 1920, a cold quiet hung over the city of Dublin, but this was not a morning for peace. As the city slept, members of the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, were preparing for a deadly and audacious operation. This was the height of the Irish War of Independence, a bitter conflict for Ireland's freedom from British rule. The IRA's Director of Intelligence, a man named Michael Collins, had orchestrated a plan to strike at the very heart of British power in Ireland. His goal was to eliminate a network of British intelligence agents who had been sent to Dublin to infiltrate and destroy the Republican movement. These agents were a serious threat to the IRA's fight for independence. The operation was meticulously planned. Collins and his intelligence unit, known as the Squad, had spent weeks gathering information. They identified the names and addresses of numerous British agents and officers living in guest houses and hotels across the city. The plan was for small teams of IRA assassins, often called gunmen, to visit these locations simultaneously at 9 o'clock in the morning. This specific time was chosen because it was believed the targets would be relaxed and unprepared, still in their beds or getting ready for the day. The coordinated nature of the attacks was designed to create maximum shock and confusion, preventing the British forces from mounting an effective response before the IRA volunteers could melt back into the city's population. The stakes were incredibly high for everyone involved. For the IRA, it was a high-risk gamble to protect their organization and prove they could challenge British authority on their own terms. If the operation succeeded, it would cripple the British intelligence network in the capital. If it failed, it could lead to the capture and execution of some of the IRA's most dedicated members. For the British, the presence of these undercover agents, many of whom were experienced officers from the First World War, was crucial to winning what they saw as a battle against terrorists. They were known as the Cairo Gang because many had served together in the Middle East, and their mission was to break the IRA's command structure. The city of Dublin was a dangerous and paranoid place at this time. British soldiers, along with the newly formed Auxiliary Division and the Black and Tans, patrolled the streets. These forces were notorious for their brutal tactics and reprisals against the Irish population. Curfews were common, and raids on homes were a nightly occurrence. In this tense atmosphere, the IRA's plan was an act of defiance. It was a clear message that no British agent, no matter how secret or powerful, was safe. As the clock ticked towards 9 a.m., dozens of young men armed with pistols made their way through the quiet Sunday streets, ready to change the course of the war forever. Make sure to hit that subscribe button for more content like this. As church bells began to ring across Dublin, the IRA's operation began. At addresses throughout the city's south side, the quiet morning was shattered by the sharp crack of gunfire. At 28 Upper Pembroke Street, a team of assassins entered a guest house where several British officers were staying. They went from room to room, shooting the men they found. 2 intelligence officers, Major Charles Dowling and Captain Leonard Price, were killed instantly. A third officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Montgomery, was gravely wounded and would later die from his injuries. The sudden and brutal violence left the survivors in a state of shock, marking the bloody start to a day that would live in infamy. Just a short distance away, at 38 Upper Mount Street, another IRA unit targeted 2 more British intelligence officers. Lieutenants Peter Ames and George Bennett were in their pajamas when the gunmen burst into their room. They were shown no mercy and were shot and killed. At the same time, a separate attack was happening at 22 Lower Mount Street. Here the target was Lieutenant Henry Anglis, an agent using the alias Patrick McMahon. The IRA team killed him, but the operation did not go entirely to plan. Another officer managed to escape, while a third barricaded himself in his room. The sound of the struggle attracted the attention of passing auxiliaries, leading to a fierce gunfight in the street. The chaos at Lower Mount Street had further deadly consequences. 2 auxiliaries, Frank Garnis and Cecil Morris, who had been sent to find reinforcements, were captured by another IRA team. They were taken to a quiet laneway, interrogated, and then shot dead. They became the first members of the feared Auxiliary Division to be killed on active duty in Ireland. Meanwhile, at other addresses, the deadly work continued. At 119 Lower Baggot Street, a team that included a young Sean Lamasse killed Captain Geoffrey Bagolet. At a nearby house, Captain William Newbury was also shot and killed. The attacks were swift, ruthless, and spread across a wide area. The scale of the operation was ambitious, and not every raid was successful. In some cases, the targeted men were not at home, or the IRA teams went to the wrong address. Some officers managed to fight back or escape. However, the overall impact was devastating for the British. In the space of about an hour, their intelligence network in Dublin had been torn apart. The coordinated strikes showed a level of planning and audacity that stunned the British authorities. The IRA had demonstrated that they could strike with precision in the heart of the capital city, turning the quiet Sunday streets into a battleground and sending a wave of fear through the administration at Dublin Castle. The mastermind behind this daring operation was Michael Collins. A charismatic and relentless leader, Collins was the IRA's Director of Intelligence and the Irish Republic's Minister for Finance. He was a central figure in the fight for independence, known for his organizational genius and his ruthless approach to warfare. Collins understood that the War of Independence was not a conventional war of armies on a battlefield. It was a war of intelligence, secrets, and shadows. He knew that to defeat the British, he had to first defeat their spies. The British agents of the Cairo Gang were his primary targets, as they posed the greatest threat to the IRA's survival and its leadership. To carry out his secret war, Collins had formed a special unit known as the Squad. This was a small, tight-knit group of full-time assassins, also nicknamed the 12 Apostles. Their sole job was to eliminate British agents, spies, and informants. The members of the Squad were young, dedicated, and utterly loyal to Collins. They were the elite of the IRA's Dublin Brigade, chosen for their courage and their ability to kill in cold blood. On Bloody Sunday morning, the Squad formed the core of the assassination teams, but they were supported by dozens of other volunteers from the Dublin Brigade who were called upon for this massive, one-off operation. One of the men who took part in the morning's attacks was Frank Teeling. He was a member of the IRA team sent to 22 Lower Mount Street. During the shootout that erupted after the assassination of Lieutenant Anglis, Teeling was shot and wounded. He was captured by the auxiliaries, becoming the only IRA man to be taken prisoner during the morning's events. His capture was a significant blow. Teeling was quickly tried by a military court and sentenced to death for his role in the killings. His execution seemed certain. However, Collins was not a man who abandoned his soldiers. He organized a daring rescue mission, and a few months later, Teeling and 2 other IRA prisoners escaped from Kilmainham Jail, a high-security prison. The men who pulled the triggers on Bloody Sunday were not just faceless gunmen, they were volunteers who deeply believed in the cause of Irish freedom. Many, like the future Taoiseach Sean Lemass, were ordinary young men who found themselves doing extraordinary and terrible things in the cause of revolution. They operated under immense pressure, knowing that capture meant almost certain death. Their actions were controversial and brutal, but in their eyes, they were soldiers fighting a necessary war. For them, the British agents were not simply men, they were symbols of an oppressive foreign power that had to be destroyed for Ireland to be free. Immediately following the morning's attacks, a fierce debate began over the identity of the men who had been killed. The British government and the press in London were quick to condemn the killings as a barbaric massacre of innocent soldiers. They claimed the victims were regular army officers, simply doing their duty, who were murdered in their beds. This narrative was designed to paint the IRA as a ruthless terrorist organization that did not follow the rules of war. It was a powerful piece of propaganda aimed at turning public opinion in Britain and internationally against the cause of Irish independence. The image of defenseless officers being shot in their pajamas was deeply shocking. The IRA, however, told a very different story. Michael Collins and the leaders of the Republican movement insisted that their targets were not regular soldiers at all. They stated that the men were highly trained, undercover intelligence agents who had been sent to Dublin with a single purpose: to crush the IRA. Collins referred to them as the Cairo Gang, a nickname that stuck, suggesting they were a professional cadre of spies. The IRA argued that these men were waging a secret and dirty war against them, using informants and torture to gather information. In their view, the assassinations were not murder, they were a legitimate act of war, a preemptive strike to eliminate a deadly threat. The truth, as is often the case in history, was somewhere in the middle. Later research by historians has provided a clearer picture of the victims. Of the 9 British Army officers killed that morning, it is now widely accepted that at least 6 of them were indeed actively involved in intelligence work. These were the men Collins had in his sights, the core of the Cairo Gang. 2 of the other officers killed were serving as court-martial officers, responsible for trying captured IRA members. While not spies, they were part of the British military justice system that the IRA saw as illegitimate. One officer, Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery, was a high-ranking staff officer with no known intelligence role. This confusion over the victims' roles was central to the propaganda war being fought by both sides. The British needed to maintain the image of their forces as peacekeepers, dealing with a criminal conspiracy. Admitting that they had a network of secret agents engaged in counterinsurgency would complicate this narrative. For the IRA, it was essential to justify their actions as a necessary military operation against enemy combatants, not the murder of ordinary soldiers. The debate over whether the men were spies or regular officers was therefore not just an academic question. It went to the very heart of how the conflict was perceived and understood by the public in Ireland, Britain, and across the world. The immediate reaction of the British authorities in Dublin was one of utter shock, disbelief, and panic. The IRA's operation had been a stunning success from a military perspective. In a single morning, they had decapitated the British intelligence network in the city. The coordinated nature and sheer audacity of the attacks sent a wave of terror through the British administration based at Dublin Castle, the center of British rule in Ireland. The castle, which was supposed to be an impregnable fortress, suddenly felt vulnerable. The message was clear. No one was safe. The IRA could strike anywhere, at any time, against anyone. In the hours following the assassinations, surviving British officers and agents from across the city fled their lodgings. They abandoned their guest houses and hotels, seeking safety behind the fortified walls of Dublin Castle. The castle became a crowded and fearful refuge for those who had escaped the morning's violence. They knew that the IRA's intelligence was superior to their own, and that their names and addresses were on an IRA death list. This mass retreat was a huge psychological victory for the IRA. It showed that the British, for all their military might, could be intimidated and forced onto the defensive by a small, determined guerrilla force. The British leadership was stunned. Winston Churchill, who was then the Secretary of State for War, famously remarked that the agents had been careless fellows, suggesting they had underestimated their enemy and paid the ultimate price. His comment revealed the frustration and surprise within the British government. They had believed their intelligence operation in Dublin was sophisticated and effective. Bloody Sunday proved it was anything but. The Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, was reportedly even more blunt in private, commenting that the agents got what they deserved for allowing themselves to be caught so easily. This was not a public statement, of course, but it showed the level of shock at the catastrophic intelligence failure. The panic among the British forces on the ground led to an immediate and brutal desire for revenge. With their intelligence network in ruins and their morale shattered, the soldiers and auxiliaries on the streets of Dublin were angry and looking for retaliation. This thirst for vengeance was not controlled or directed by the leadership in the castle, who were still trying to understand what had happened. Instead, it was a spontaneous and furious reaction from the rank-and-file members of the Crown forces. This uncontrolled anger would lead directly to the second tragic event of the day, as the Crown forces descended on a Gaelic football match at Croke Park, ready to unleash their fury on the civilian population. In the aftermath of the morning's assassinations, leaders on both the British and Irish sides were quick to issue public statements. Their words were aimed at shaping public opinion and justifying their actions to a shocked world. The British government, through its officials in Dublin Castle, released a statement condemning the organized massacre of its officers. They portrayed the IRA as a gang of criminals and murderers. The Chief Secretary for Ireland, Sir Hamar Greenwood, spoke in the British Parliament, describing the victims as defenseless men killed in cold blood. His words were designed to evoke sympathy for the British and outrage against the Irish Republicans. Michael Collins, writing under a pseudonym, responded with a powerful and unapologetic justification for the IRA's actions. He made it clear that this was not murder, but a calculated act of war. "My one intention," he wrote, "was the destruction of the undesirables who continued to make miserable the lives of ordinary decent citizens." He accused the British agents of being part of a secret murder gang themselves, responsible for the torture and killing of Irish prisoners. Collins famously declared, "I have paid them back in their own coin." His statement was a defiant challenge to the British narrative, framing the IRA as protectors of the Irish people against a tyrannical foreign intelligence service. The private comments of British leaders revealed their deep frustration. Winston Churchill's description of the assassinated agents as careless fellows was a candid admission of the failure of their intelligence system. It showed that behind the public outrage, there was a grudging respect for the IRA's efficiency and a deep anger at their own agents' lack of security. Prime Minister David Lloyd George's reported comment that the agents got what they deserved was even more revealing. It suggested that he understood, on some level, that his agents were playing a dangerous game and had lost. These private remarks stood in stark contrast to the public condemnations and painted a picture of a government in crisis. The conflicting statements from both sides created a war of words that mirrored the physical conflict on the streets. For the British public, the story was one of a cowardly ambush on their soldiers. For the Irish public and supporters of independence abroad, it was a story of a brave blow struck for freedom against a network of spies. These competing narratives were crucial. The Irish War of Independence was fought not only with guns, but also with propaganda. The words of Collins and Greenwood were weapons in this battle for the hearts and minds of people in Ireland, Britain, and across the globe. Each side needed to convince the world that their cause was just and their actions were necessary. The anger and desire for revenge among the British forces in Dublin did not take long to boil over. Later that afternoon, a large crowd of about 5,000 people gathered at Croke Park, a stadium in the north of the city, to watch a Gaelic football match between Dublin and Tipperary. Gaelic games were a huge part of Irish culture and national identity, and the match was intended to be a welcome distraction from the tension of the war. However, the British forces saw this large gathering of civilians as an opportunity to retaliate for the morning's assassinations. They suspected that some of the gunmen from the morning might be hiding in the crowd. A convoy of British troops and auxiliaries surrounded the stadium. Without warning, they began firing into the crowd. Panic erupted as thousands of terrified men, women, and children ran for their lives trying to escape the gunfire. The shooting was indiscriminate and lasted for about 90 seconds. When it was over, the field was littered with bodies. 14 civilians were dead or dying, and many more were wounded. The victims included 3 schoolboys, one of whom was just 10 years old. A young woman who was due to be married the following week was also killed. One of the players on the field, Michael Hogan from Tipperary, was shot and killed as he crawled to cover. The violence of the day was not yet over. That evening, back at Dublin Castle, 3 prisoners were killed in mysterious circumstances. 2 of them were high-ranking IRA officers, Dick McKee and Peter Clancy, who had been instrumental in planning the morning's attacks. The third man was a civilian named Conor Clune, who had been arrested by mistake. The official British account claimed that the 3 men were shot while trying to escape. However, the IRA and many others believed this was a lie. The bodies of the men showed signs of brutal torture, leading to the widespread belief that they had been interrogated, beaten, and then executed in an act of revenge by their captors. The events at Croke Park and Dublin Castle turned a day of calculated IRA violence into a day of widespread bloodshed and terror. The killing of unarmed civilians at a sporting event, which became known as the Croke Park Massacre, was a public relations disaster for the British government. It was impossible to justify the shooting of children and spectators as a legitimate act of war. The deaths of McKee, Clancy, and Clune in custody further fueled the belief that the British forces were acting as a law unto themselves, engaging in torture and extrajudicial killings. The day that had begun with an IRA operation ended with the Crown forces committing atrocities that would horrify the world. The events of Bloody Sunday, from the morning assassinations to the Croke Park Massacre, had a profound and lasting impact on the Irish War of Independence. For the IRA, the morning's operation was a major success. It effectively destroyed the British intelligence network in Dublin and boosted the morale of the Republican movement. It proved that the IRA could challenge the British Empire in its own administrative capital. However, the brutal British retaliation at Croke Park and Dublin Castle overshadowed this military victory. The killing of innocent civilians galvanized Irish public opinion against British rule like never before. Many people who had previously been neutral were now pushed towards supporting the fight for independence. In Britain, the news from Dublin was met with shock and growing unease. While the press condemned the IRA's actions, the subsequent massacre at Croke Park was difficult to defend. Liberal voices in Britain and members of the opposition Labour Party began to question the government's entire policy in Ireland. They were horrified by the reports of indiscipline and brutality by the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries. The idea that British forces were shooting unarmed civilians at a football match damaged Britain's reputation on the international stage, particularly in the United States, where there was a large and influential Irish-American population. The moral authority of the British government was severely weakened. The legacy of that day is still felt in Ireland. The Gaelic Athletic Association, which organizes Gaelic games, named one of the main stands at Croke Park the Hogan Stand, in memory of Michael Hogan, the player who was killed. This serves as a permanent reminder of the tragedy and the link between Irish culture and the struggle for independence. The events of Bloody Sunday became a powerful symbol of British oppression and Irish resistance. They were recounted in ballads and stories, becoming a key part of the national memory and inspiring future generations of Republicans. The day demonstrated the brutal cycle of violence and reprisal that defined the war. Ultimately, Bloody Sunday was a turning point. It exposed the failure of Britain's policy of trying to crush the rebellion with force and counter-terror. The atrocities committed by Crown forces made it increasingly difficult for the British government to maintain its position, both at home and abroad. The events hardened attitudes on both sides, but they also accelerated the process that would eventually lead to a truce and negotiations the following year. The Day of Blood, which began with Michael Collins's ruthless plan and ended with the massacre of innocents, showed that a military victory was impossible for either side, and that a political solution was the only way to end the terrible conflict.